Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Blizzard does not treat every class equally. Shocking, I know. Okay, well, I actually do think they do a pretty good job of that in terms of gameplay, despite what many a forum post may tell you. What I'm referring to is how they treat every class in the lore. It should be screamingly obvious to anyone who's played for more than a few months that certain classes just straight up get better representation than others. And I think we can put it into a pretty sturdy hierarchy, with the most pivotal factor usually being if a class has strong ties to the human race. So as a starting point, I think Blizzard actually did us a big favor here back in Legion, because back then, every class received its own personalized list of followers to use for the mission board and as bodyguards. We can use these lists as a litmus test since they should be lists of characters Blizzard considers memorable and fitting representations of the classes. It should be noted that, generally, the very top tier characters of a class were not utilized. You're not going to see Thrall as a shaman follower or Jaina as a mage follower. Also, to be fair to certain characters, they may have been set up in Legion to become more relevant later on. But let's get right into it. It's a bit unfortunate that I did play in Legion so thoroughly, because that inherently taught me a lot of these characters. So ultimately my criterion for checking if a character is truly recognizable was, do I think they serve a purpose in the game other than being a completely pointless character just to fill out the roster? Obviously, my opinions may differ from yours, but here's what I wound up with. Rogue, 9, Druid, 8, Mage, Warrior, Priest, and Death Knight, 6, Paladin, 5, Shaman and Monk, 4, Hunter, 3, Demon Hunter and Warlock, 2, and Evoker was non-applicable. The results actually wound up being pretty dang close to how I would actually rank the class's story representation. There are only a few that I would actually move around, for various reasons that I'll get into. There is some nuance here, but let's begin, shall we? In S tier, I believe we can place Paladins, which, surprise surprise, is both available to humans and often strongly tied to them. After all, the original Paladins of Azeroth were the Order of the Silver Hand, a group of 5 warriors trained in the ways of the light by Alonce's Fowl. Of course, Draenei Paladins would also become prominent once they entered the story, but human Paladin has been baked into the DNA of Warcraft for a long time, and it doesn't seem like they're eager to shed that concept anytime soon. Heck, one could consider Tyrion being set up as Arthas' primary adversary in Wrath in lieu of the many other characters with a more direct connection to him, like Muradin or Jaina or Sylvanas, as Blizz really wanting to have a human paladin wielding the light and saving the day. It's not exactly a surprise that male human paladin has emerged as a derogatory term toward a certain breed of roleplayer on the lore and story forums. And even just using relatively prevalent characters, we've got Uther, Tyrion, Turalyon, and Tyrosus, and at one time Arthas, Bolvar, and Alexandros and Darion Mograine. Other prominent paladins include Liadrin, Eretor, Faerun and the Lamplighters, Murad, Irel. Frankly, a ton of Death Knights used to be paladins, and I'm being fairly stringent on what counts as a paladin here. Suffice to say that if being represented in the lore is important to you, you'll never be taking a risk rolling paladin. Unless of course you're like a Tauren or Zandalari, because aside from mounts, all of their abilities are still human-coded, and the biggest name they'll throw your way is Sunwalker Desco or Epony Brightmane. Rivaling paladins for the top of the list, we have mages. And whereas almost every bad paladin gets rebranded as a Death Knight, mages are allowed to exist with both positive and negative depictions, although they will sometimes be rebranded as warlocks. Again, humans are the major contributor here, but it's at least less of a monopoly in this case. After all, the Blue Dragonflight is all about magic if you want to count any of them, and magic has played a very important role in the history of the elven races as well. Actually, the fact that I keep using the term magic to refer to mage content helps explain why they're so common. If Blizzard ever needs to have a character that utilizes magic but doesn't necessarily want to flavor it with cosmic forces or nature or anything, mage kind of gets chosen by default. As I said, pretty much any blue dragon can be classified as a mage, the aspects Malygos and Caligos chief among them. As far as Night Elves go, we had Azshara and her many followers, as well as Mordant Evenshade. The only reason there aren't more prominent ones is because their society for a long time rejected arcane magic following the War of the Ancients. The High Elves and Blood Elves that migrated from their society had more though, Antonidas, Kael'thas, Romoth, and Aethys among them. And we can probably count Umbric for the Void Elves. Nightborn are pretty much night elves if they fully embraced magic. Elisande, Thalyssra, Valtrois, and Oculith could all qualify. Let's not forget the Guardians, who were basically uber mages created by other mages channeling their power into one. Greatest among them were Egwene and Medivh. And of course, there's Khadgar, who didn't receive the raw power boost, but is incredibly skilled. And I haven't even mentioned Ronin or Jaina yet. For some reason, despite the class fantasy depending on knowledge, humans seem amazingly capable of keeping up with millennia-old elves. But we also have more eccentric choices, like Millhouse Manastorm and Meryl Fellstorm. So overall, yeah, mages have plenty of screen time. Moving down into A tier, we have warriors. Unfortunately, warriors are the hardest to round up, because any melee character that doesn't have a distinguishing feature of another class can sort of be classified here by default. I mean, if there's one class you could use to describe troops or adventurers and have it not sound totally weird, it'd be warriors. In that sense, it's actually one of the most inclusive classes around. We've got Anduin Lothar, Dalen Proudmoore, Danath Trollbane, and Varian Rind as standout human warriors. Orcs also get a ton of love here, with Grom, Garrosh, Blackhand, Doomhammer, Sourfang, Gayara, Durotan, Eitrig, and others. Seriously, orc warriors may be more of a thing than human paladins. Tauren have both Cairn and his son Bane, as well as Mela for the High Mountain tribe. Dwarves have both Magni and Muradin. Worgen have Gengraymane and Crowley. Blood Elves have Lorthamar. Even Night Elves have Jared Shadowsong. Heck, by sheer numbers, warriors could probably have won this ranking. The only reason they don't is because the warriorness of warriors is often not emphasized. It's one of the classes that struggles most with having a unifying fantasy beyond hit enemies with big thing. I mean, honestly, I've seen warrior players ready to, at the drop of a hat, RP in the comments section about how thinking too much work, we zug instead. And as if trying to define that class fantasy, the Legion followers leaned way too hard into the Vrykul/Valhalla/Halls of Valor concept. Let's talk about priests, whom you could conceptually consider a mixture of the two S-tier classes. You've got the holy aspect of paladins and the caster aspect of mages, so unsurprisingly, they get a lot of love as well. However, priests also show off the opposite side of the coin with shadow priests. Although there is a bit of an emphasis on humans again, there is overall much better racial balance than with paladins. For humans, we've got Benedictus and Anduin. Draenei got a strong showing here with Velen and Ishana. Even the undead have multiple examples with Alansis Fowl and Kalia Menethil. Not to mention Zabra Hex for trolls, Moira for dwarves, Talanji for the Zandalari, and Tyrande for night elves. Well, Tyrande kind of straddles the line with Hunter, but I'm counting her here. So lots of coverage overall without being nearly so human-centric. I think priests benefit a lot from being the apex of many cultures' religious beliefs, which inherently makes them likely to be important. Do you like night elves? Do you like races that strongly align themselves with night elves? Well, congratulations, druids have got you covered. Although druidism is by no means a purely night elven practice, they do get the lion's share of attention with it. Cenarius and his Keepers of the Grove pioneered their practice, and it was picked up and mastered by Malfurion as well as others such as Fandral, Brol, Thessaly, and Narralex. Most other races tend to get one prominent practitioner apiece. Hemil Rune Totem for the Tauren, Celestine for Worgen, Lodi for the Zandalari, Ulfar for Kultirans, Zentabra for Darkspear, and so on. Technically, trolls of all sorts have gotten a lot of representation as they often shapeshift into avatars of their various Loa, though these are by and large minor characters that get killed off quickly and just fill up the troll dungeon and raid boss lists. So a bit more niche than priests were, and very heavily night elf focused, but druids do get plenty of love in total. We're down in B tier now. Death Knights are a fascinating case because of how they're made. Nobody studies to become one. They are usually accomplished individuals of other classes who get job sniped by whoever the current Lich King is. This also means there's an amazing potential for racial diversity here. Ultimately, humans still wind up getting most of the coverage, though. We have Arthas and Bolvar, Alexandros and Darian Mograine, Baron Rivendare, Thessarian, Whitemane, and Thoros Trollbane. Orcs do get some love here as well, though, which seems fair given that the first Lich King was an orc. We have Dranosh Sourfang, briefly, as well as Nazgrim, and we can't forget Koltira for Blood Elves. But already, you can start to feel the list tightening up. Despite the fact that anyone who dies could come back as a Death Knight, we really only had two big waves: Wrath and the preceding lore of the Scourge, and Legion when the Ebon Blade made a real effort to bolster their ranks, particularly with the new Four Horsemen. But, as with many of their edgier classes, Blizz seems hesitant to give its ranks much of a heroic focus. You would think that Hunter of all classes would be at a higher tier, but there aren't actually that many prominent ones. Unless of course you're a High Elf, because we've got all three Windrunner sisters repping here. Sylvanas also covers the Forsaken, along with her champion Nathanos. Blood Elves have Haldoran, and Night Elves have Chandris. Plus, sort of, Tyrande. And Dwarves don't have a bad showing either, between Hemet Nessingwary, Bran Bronzebeard, and the very first character to appear in a WoW cinematic. Despite all of the elf and even dwarf focus, the game's most iconic hunter is probably Rexxar, a half-orc, half-ogre. Helm High Mountain also got some shine in Legion and Shadowlands. I suppose the Forsaken also have their elite force of Dark Rangers that fit in here. Surprisingly, we don't really have any major human presence here. It could just be because humans couldn't be hunters until Cataclysm. Or perhaps Blizz recognized how many classes humans dominated and decided they didn't really need to reign over this one as well. Anyway, a moderate amount of prominent characters, but with nothing really stopping them from adding more in the future. In C tier, we have Rogues, which might be a surprising inclusion considering how many recognizable characters were made into followers. Well, that's the thing. Pretty much all recognizable rogues were made into followers. There's almost nobody else left. And I can see why this happened. Rogues, by their very nature, tend to not be the focal characters of the story. They want to stay explicitly out of focus. I mean, the only noteworthy rogue characters who weren't made into followers were Edwin Van Cleef, who was dead, Renzik the Shiv, who was alive then but is obviously dead now, and Kelsey Steelspark. I guess since Legion, Voss, and Tess have both been promoted to leadership positions. Racially speaking, there is a slight human bias, as there is with almost every class, but things feel fairly balanced outside of that. We've got Garona for Orcs, Voss for Undead, Taushi for Pandaren, Valera for Blood Elves, and Tess for... Nope, never mind. Sorry again, Worgen players. So yeah, it's a small roster, but with some good diversity and some recognizable names, along with no real barriers to growth should Blizzard ever want to add more rogue characters in the future. And hey, we actually did get two new rogues in the War Within, Merrix for Earthen, and Kaiveza for Ethereals. Let's hope they ever do anything in the story ever again. Shaman are also lower than one might imagine, given it's a very cool and broad class fantasy. But I suppose when you consider in vanilla times it was the Horde counterpart to Paladins, it makes sense. The Orc equivalent is never going to get as much love as the human one, and it is indeed a class most strongly tied to Orcs. There's Thrall, of course, but also Drekthar, Agra, and Rhaegar Earthfury. But I wouldn't call it a monopoly either. Vol'jin for Darkspear Trolls, Rastakhan for Zandalari, Magatha for Tauren. Draenei are definitely the core of the Alliance shamanism, with Farseer Nobundo being their biggest name, but you also have Falstad Wildhammer for some dwarven representation. Surprisingly, not really any big names for Kultirans, despite being a good fit, in my opinion. I suppose we did get Lufcella recently for Earthen. She won't be forgotten about, right? Right? Ultimately, Shaman is a class that can boast really cool characters and can add them without much fuss, but just hasn't done so very often. That's something that applies to most of these mid-tier classes, I'm sure you've noticed. Things are getting rough now, which means we're entering into D tier, and I have to place monks here for a very simple reason. Despite technically being made readily available to pretty much every race in the game, Blizzard has put practically zero effort into making the class feel like it fits for any race other than Pandaren. Seriously, you've got one really good rep of each spec: Chen for Brewmaster, Lili for Mistweaver, and Terran Zu for Windwalker. And I suppose we should mention Isa and G. And that's about it. Obviously, Pandaren themes were always going to have a degree of overlap, but there was still potential to make it work elsewhere. Dwarven races, after all, could be great fits for Brewmaster. Orcish Blade Masters kind of feel like an appropriate fit for Windwalker. Heck, you could even make an argument for Darkspear and Zandalari Trolls, given their focus on Wild Gods. But ultimately, the August Celestials are way too prominent of an element in their class fantasy, and way too tethered to Pandaren. I do like the August Celestials, but I cannot deny that they hamstring the class's wider fantasy potential. If you want to play a non-Pandaren monk, you're in for a tough time. Trust me, I've been struggling with this dilemma for years. In a very similar boat, we have Demon Hunters. I challenge you to name me any Demon Hunter other than Illidan. Go ahead, I'm waiting. Of course, I'm sure many of you can come up with a few, but even if there is an okayish list of demon hunters out there, almost none of them have any continuing presence in the story. Like, I recognize Aloramus from that one quest chain in Vanilla. I recognize Altruist from that other quest chain in the Burning Crusade. I remember fighting Leotheros the Blind in Serpentine Cavern. I know Corvus kind of acted as the most front and center Illidari in the class hall stuff. And I know Adaris pioneered the Devourer spec so that he can drive us to the ground like a beast. But seriously, none of these guys have mattered to the story at all beyond either the expansion they were introduced or Legion itself. It was not the best thought out class concept, we have to admit. Heck, with the first reveal, I immediately thought fan service class, even if it did grow on me over time. But there didn't seem to be a ton of foresight here. It doesn't help matters at all that the class has been locked to just Night Elves and Blood Elves, and now Void Elves as well. I know they're the poster children of the class, but you know there are other races with reasons to hate demons out there, right? The fact that no effort was ever made to include Orcs and Draenei, who would be perfect fits, should tell you all you need to know about how much story prominence the class is going to have going forward. Heck, excited as I am for the Devourer spec, it's kind of a symptom of the problem of having a class so focused on killing one enemy type that is no longer a prominent threat in the story. Also, Akama is clearly a recognizable character, but he was classed in the Outsider spec that Demon Hunter followers had for the mission table gameplay. He's not really a Demon Hunter himself, and is only here because of his close ties to Illidan. Another edgy class that gets almost no major characters to follow are Warlocks. Like, legitimately, the only two characters I would consider to be big deal Warlocks are Gul'dan and Cho'Gall. I mean, you could count most demons if you want to be generous, since they all use Fel and can usually summon other demons, but clearly your character can't relate to those so well. And just look at their Legion followers. The list is chock full of absolute nobodies. Who even are these clowns? Zinnin Smythe? Shinfel Blightsworn? Kira Iresoul? Wilfred Fizzlebang's sister? I honestly pity whoever had to pick Warlock followers, because we just aren't allowed to have Warlocks who are both prominent and not playing the part of the villain. Seriously, Orcs are the only race with prominent Warlock representation, and by and large, that represents their dark past more than any current heroes. I get it. Warlocks, even the ones we're supposed to root for, exist in the underbelly of society. What they do isn't pretty, even if sometimes necessary. But, it's seriously bare bones here. This is a class that has existed since Vanilla. Give us something. Why does every racial leader need to be a priest, mage, or warrior? And way at the bottom, we have Evokers at E tier. E because Evoker. And this really shouldn't surprise anybody at all. Yes, it is the newest class, which means it's had the least amount of time to establish significant lore characters, but even given another decade, I don't see much changing. The class is just way too specific. They wield the power of all 5 Dragonflights and had to be genetically engineered by Neltharion to even exist. The lore will have to be seriously bent to ever extend the class beyond Drakthir. And even looking at the Drakthir, who do we have? They pretty much gave us one per flight color. Emberthal got the lion's share of focus, and is pretty much the only prominent evoker at this point, if you want to call it prominent. There's Sarkareth, who didn't have a lot of fans and is dead now. And then you have Azurathel, the Alliance rep, who is stoic, I guess. And Sindrathresh, the Horde rep, who is fun-loving, I guess. And Viridia, the healer, who is preservation spec. That's it. Oh, and Desran, I think? Yeah, that's pretty much it. The class is represented by Emberthal, and feels like it only ever will be, which is the sign of a pretty poorly thought out class idea. It feels like they just really wanted to ship a new class with Dragonflight and just defaulted to their usual approach of making them the elite super soldiers of a dark character without considering all of the consequences. Sorry, Evokers, you're kind of stuck in the dumpster. It's literally in your DNA. So, just a quick recap, we have S tier with Paladin and Mage, A tier with Warrior, Priest, and Druid, B tier with Death Knight and Hunter, C tier with Rogue and Shaman, D tier with Monk, Demon Hunter, and Warlock, and E tier with Evoker. Ultimately, this video feels mostly like me pointing out the obvious. It isn't the most important thing in the world either, but it was fun to actually analyze it a bit more closely. And really, it can be a bit exasperating wanting to roll characters of some of those lower tier classes if you don't feel like your race is strongly tied to it, or like it has much of a place in the lore at all. When choosing which characters to create or highlight in the future, a better spread is something I think Blizz should try to keep in mind. I mean, don't ruin the story over it or anything, but I think we'll be okay without another human paladin, orc warrior, or night elf druid for the foreseeable future. For this week's drawing, I decided to go with Cho'Gall, the reason being that the underrepresented classes are the ones that kind of motivated me to make this video in the first place. And yeah, now that I've drawn Gul'dan and Cho'Gall, I don't really have any more warlocks to draw, unless of course we're counting demons. Anyway, Cho'Gall is an alright character, not super interesting, but he's not bad either. I guess the entire concept of certain ogres, particularly casters, having two heads has always been an interesting one. I ultimately decided to go with something resembling his Hots look, because that feels more like an actual ogre's body. The model we are given for Cho'Gall in Cataclysm and Warlords of Draenor has been super deformed by the Void, and it kind of just looks like a big triangle, and Gall has like a bird beak. I like this better, and I drew him in Heimal just because that's one of the places he's most prominently featured. Also, props to the HOTS development team for coming up with such a unique hero. Or two heroes, I guess. But that does it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye!